Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining. I'm excited to be back speaking for Colette, and this is a topic that's not talked about very much, so I hope you'll find it interesting and useful. A little bit about me. I work for Cambridge, as Brigitte mentioned, and I'm coming to you from quite a grey, cold Cambridge today, unlike Tanya, who seems to be in the sunshine. I work for Cambridge mostly on teacher training projects, designing and delivering events and programs for teachers. And as Brigitte mentioned, I'm also a Cambridge author. So my book for Cambridge focuses on teacher training. If that's of interest to you, then do check it out. I'd like to know a little bit about you as well, though. And in particular, given the topic of our talk today, this is what I really want to know. Are you an advanced speaker of English? And when I say advanced in this context, I really mean C1 or above. You might be proficient, you might be a little bit lower, but just let me know what you consider your level of English to be. Thank you for putting the poll up there, Brigitte. I can see the results coming in, so we'll just I'll just give you a moment to fill in the poll, and then we'll share what's happening. So 11% of people so far saying English is your first language, and then the huge majority of you, 87%, saying that you are an advanced speaker and it's not your first language. So you have learnt English and you have my enormous admiration for reaching that level. 88% now. I'm not sure how many people have voted. Do you know, Brigitte? No. But I think we ended up with 87%. So that's obviously of relevance because I'm here talking to you about how best to teach advanced speakers grammar. But if you are advanced speakers, then you have just as much to say, probably more to say on the topic than me. So please do feel free to put your comments into the chat box as we go through. It'll be really interesting to get your perspectives. This is what we'll be talking about. So we'll just start by thinking about how we might define an advanced learner and some different perspectives on what makes an advanced learner. And from that, we'll look at some implications for teachers and things that you might do or do differently in your classrooms as a result of those perspectives. So this will become clear as we go through. So let's begin by talking about how we define an advanced learner. Maybe define is not quite the right word. It's more about the perspective that we take. And I'd like to offer you 3 perspectives on what an advanced learner is. So the first one is to define an advanced learner by what they can do linguistically. And we can do this very easily by looking at the CEFR, which states that learners at advanced level or C1 level can understand a wide range of demanding longer texts. They can recognize implicit meaning. They can express themselves fluently and spontaneously. They can use language flexibly and effectively for a range of purposes. And they can produce clear, well-structured, detailed text on complex subjects. And text there doesn't just mean written text, it means spoken text as well. So the main use of this is to guide our learning objectives and our course outcomes, our course content, if you like. It doesn't really tell us much about how we should go about teaching advanced learners. So it's useful, but it's useful only up to a point, I think. We all have an idea as teachers of what an advanced learner looks like. I'm sure you've had classes where you can spot an advanced learner. You can spot somebody who should be in a different level because they're too advanced or because they're not advanced enough, perhaps. So we all have an idea, really, of what an advanced learner is in terms of what they can do linguistically. So it might be more useful then to think about what advanced learners can do as learners. Obviously, advanced learners are, by definition, successful learners because they've reached a high level. So in most cases, they can direct their own learning. They can make their own decisions about what to do and why they need to do it. They can assess their own needs fairly well. This is not always true. It's not 100% true. But in general, advanced learners know what they need to improve and they know what they're good at. They can access authentic sources. Maybe access is the wrong word. They can understand authentic sources, or they can manage authentic sources. So they can watch English language TV or movies. They can read English language magazines or newspapers. They might not get everything, but they can get the vast majority of the content there. They can accomplish most communicative goals. This is a kind of a double-edged sword. A good example is my father-in-law. He's Egyptian, and he's spent most of his life in the UK, but his English is, I would say, probably B2 level. So he's not quite advanced, but he's an excellent communicator. He's spent most of his life in the catering industry. At one point, he was the food and beverage manager at Harrods, and so it was his job to greet the celebrity guests coming into the restaurant. So he's met heads of state, he's met presidents, he's met German chancellors, and he's able to talk with them, make them feel welcome, and leave a good impression, despite not being an advanced speaker of English. So for learners who are able to do that, there may not be an imperative for them to reach the next level. They may, their language may fossilize, and they may feel that there's no need really for them to study further. Advanced learners are also able to notice grammatical morphemes in the language that they hear in a way that lower level learners are not able to do. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Here's a simple question and answer. How do you travel to university? I walk there. And here's the same question, but in the past. How did you travel to university? I walked there. But for a native speaker like myself, I don't pronounce these answers differently. They're the same. I walked there, I walked there. So there's research to indicate that the audio stream is the same for both of these answers, even though one denotes the past. And that obviously causes a lot of problems for learners of English. I'm very sorry on behalf of my countrymen for that issue. But advanced learners are able to overcome this because they're able to know what to expect in a way that learners at lower levels are not able to do. So this can cause enormous problems for lower level learners because they're not able to use the English that they hear to learn in the same way that an advanced learner might be able to do. So let's just flick back. As we know, 87 or 88% of you are advanced users of English. Is there anything that you think should be added to this list? Answers in the chat if there is. Think about yourself as a learner of English. Is there anything that you feel you're able to do, or maybe that you're not able to do, that affects your ability to continue learning English? No thoughts so far? I'm going to have a sip of tea and then we'll move on. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, you get bored with exercises. I'm glad you said that because we'll address that to some extent further on. And I assume you get bored, Karen, because exercises are too easy, or just is it because you've just done so many of them in your career as a learner? Julia says understanding dialects of English. Is that something that you find different, Julia? Sarah, this is a question for for all of you who are advanced second language users of English, is there anything that you think should be added to this list? What that defines you as a language learner that is relevant to your, or that would be relevant to a teacher if someone were teaching you? Thanks, Karen. Yeah, so many exercises. I mean, I can only imagine how many you must have done to reach, the level of English that you have. Thousands, probably. Good. Let's move on. If you're still writing, do put your answers in the chat, and I'll pick them up. So this is the second way that we might be able to look at advanced learners. Maria says, I'm still slow in speaking compared to a native speaker. That's interesting. I wonder if, Maria, if you mean slow in the way that you pronounce your English, or slow in terms of thinking of what to say. I think, let me flick back briefly to method 1, because we see here in the CFR in point 2, it says advanced learners can express themselves without much obvious searching for expressions, but I think that's not necessarily a kind of black and white feature of advanced learners. Certainly, I know myself, I'm a native speaker, and I'm sure you'll hear me as we go through this talk searching for expressions, because that's just something that needs to happen sometimes. I'm doing it right now. All right. Method 3 is the most interesting one, I think. And again, you'll have plenty to say about this, but I think we can define advanced learners by how it feels to be an advanced learner. Some of what you're saying, I think, Maria talking about feeling that she's slow in speaking, kind of speaks to this point. So, for example, as an advanced learner, you are learning, the language that you're learning is much lower frequency language. You've learned all the frequent stuff. You've learned the everyday stuff. And in order to keep developing, you're having to learn stuff that's not used very often. So it feels less useful, perhaps, or less usable, that you don't have the opportunities to use it in the same way as something like the past tense, which you can use all the time when you're a lower level learner. And on that point, most of the input that you get at this level is not new. You have to take in a huge amount of English in order to get new expressions, new vocabulary, new grammatical structures. So it may feel as though your study time isn't being used in the most effective way. Again, based on these points, your progress is slower because more work's needed in order to keep improving. You have to listen to more English to get an increasingly diminishing, does that work? Amount of language, amount of new language. So all of this contributes potentially to lower motivation and a sense of plateauing. Once again, in the chat, I wonder does this resonate with you? Do you feel this way, or do you have something more positive to say about how it feels to be an advanced user of English? Mariana said in the chat, I assume this is something that you can do, Mariana. You can understand subtle jokes and implicit meanings. That obviously takes a lot of linguistic skill to be able to do. So that's a good example, I think. Araceli says, understanding newspaper headlines. There's an enormous amount of ellipsis in newspaper headlines, so that's not very easy to do. It's interesting that you've raised that one. And Maria says you can read between the lines. Yeah. Claudia says, when I've read a book, I can't remember afterwards if it was in German or English. That's really interesting. And I guess it means you've kind of gone beyond the language then, Claudia. You've gone completely beyond the language into the meaning, and the story itself. That's a really interesting indicator of, really proficient reading. And Simone says, English native speakers are very lenient with us. It's difficult to find one who's willing to correct us. I mean, hopefully, Simone, if you're paying someone to teach you, they should be willing to correct you. It's different, of course, isn't it? If it's a friend or a colleague, I wouldn't, I wouldn't correct a colleague unless they asked me to on the spot. And Karen says this resonates. Great, thanks, Karen. So I think taking all of this, taking these three methods or three perspectives on advanced learners. Oh, let's just speak about the plateau for a moment. I wonder if you experience this sense that when you're starting to learn English, everything you learn is useful and new, and so it feels like you're making tremendous progress. But as you go on, that feeling diminishes. So perhaps when we get to kind of the big smiley face with the teeth, that's when you feel like, wow, I'm going to get really good at English. I'm going to master this language. And then you start to realize just how much you don't know yet. And that kind of feeling of the daunting task ahead of you sets in, and you get this plateau effect. Certainly there are lots of learners who experience this and then give up and don't keep learning. And I don't think it's just a feature of language learning. People trying to get fit, might experience the same effect, then they give up. And then when it comes to getting fit again, they kind of get stuck into a cycle. And I know that I've come across learners who get stuck in the same cycle, and so they never reach that advanced level. I think that this is significant because obviously advanced learners have kind of gone beyond this, and that speaks to the study skills and the kind of self-directed nature of what they're able to bring to their language learning. Corey's said something along those lines, saying being advanced also means that you notice your own mistakes and errors while using the language, and you can actually reflect on your own use and notice when something is off. I like that expression. So you kind of self-monitor in a way that you can't do when you're at a lower level. But in terms of implications, and this is what we'll structure the rest of the talk around, what we should be doing as teachers is potentially involving advanced learners in setting their own learning objectives because they are so self-directed. We should be using authentic sources and highlighting how relevant these sources are. We need to do something to help ensure a sense of progress in advanced learners. And we need to help them develop strategies for coping with demotivation when it comes, if it comes, or a sense of plateauing. So these are the four things we'll look at over the next 25 minutes or so. So first off, negotiating learning objectives. Some people would argue and have argued that learners should be autonomous, and that means letting them choose what they learn. But there are different ways of doing this. Here's one example from this book, Lessons from Good Language Learners. And in this example, Sarah Cotterill, the author, talks about a class that she had when she was a teacher at university. Her students were highly proficient postgraduates attending a 12-week course to prepare them for master's and doctoral studies. She knew that they were very engaged in their own learning and able to assess their own needs because they would frequently ask for clarification on the purpose or the aim of the activities that she was giving them in class. They wanted to know how this was going to benefit them in their future studies. And 5 weeks into the course, a group of students came to her with a proposal. They said, how about we choose which classes we come to, because we feel some are more useful to us than others, and to kind of make up for the classes that we missed, we will develop an individual study program, and we'll kind of run that past you so that you know we're still working. So this is kind of an example of the learning outcomes being negotiated at the behest of the students. I think it's a fairly unusual example. I mean, I remember from my own teaching, for example, a group of advanced learners who asked me that not to do any writing in the class. They wanted to spend their class time doing speaking tasks or listening tasks. They didn't want to do any writing. That's a kind of lower level version of the same thing. But here you have students actually coming to the teacher and saying, we want to completely reform how and when we study. This teacher thought it was a good idea, but the university refused to allow it. And that's, I mean, not particularly surprising, but disappointing, I think. I think the thing to remember if you do want to negotiate your syllabus with advanced learners is that you don't have to, it doesn't have to be such a big thing. You don't have to completely negotiate everything. So you can discuss course objectives and outcomes at the start of the course. And it may be, I don't know, maybe you're teaching an exam course, and at the end of that course, everybody's going to take Cambridge C1 Advanced exam. That's quite restrictive. It means that you need to cover certain topics. You may not have a lot of room for negotiation, and your learners may not feel the need to negotiate. If your learners have a more diverse range of learning goals, it might be appropriate then to discuss what they want to do, what they don't want to do, and so on. You might, for example, offer your students time to go through their copy of Advanced Grammar in Use and see which elements they feel very comfortable with. You know, they feel that they don't need your help with those, and which elements they really definitely want to focus on as part of their course. So using the textbook as a framework really for this negotiation of the syllabus. You might decide to allocate lessons, and it could be, I don't know, once a semester you allow time, you allow one lesson to go to kind of for your students to spend working independently with your support, you know, going from student to student to answer questions, for example. So in that situation, your students will be focusing on different things because they might have different learning goals, but you're just allocating a small part of your course to self-study or individual study. And if you're doing that, you might also kind of schedule regular progress check-ins. So once a term or once a semester, you might have a conversation with your class and say, look, is everyone happy? Do you all feel that you're learning what you need to be learning and want to be learning? Should we kind of bring it back together and all start learning the same thing? Or do you want more autonomy? Do you want more diversity in what you're studying? So there's a spectrum of possible approaches here. And it's not for everyone. It won't work for everybody in every context. If you're teaching a very large class, it's probably not a possibility for you. So it will probably only work with small groups of learners. You might be constrained by some of the decisions set by your institution or your department, particularly when it comes to assessment. You might find that some learners object. They just want the course that they signed up for, which is understandable. And it may not be, you know, just the learners who find this uncomfortable. You might find it a bit uncomfortable yourself to accept from the learners or to cede that kind of control over your syllabus to the learners. That's not an easy thing to do sometimes. But I think there's probably room for most teachers to allow some kind of negotiation. Even if it's at the small level that I mentioned of would you like to do your writing in class or out of class, for example, that kind of thing. The second area, using authentic, not sources. And it's worth, at this point, I think, just checking that we all understand the same thing by authentic. So answers in the chat box. What do you understand by the word authentic in this context? What does authentic mean to you? Okay, Coralie says sources by native speakers. I'm not sure that necessarily needs to be the case. Verena says sources that have not been adapted in order to make the language easier. And that's a bit closer. Jacqueline, I think, has probably got the definition that's closest to mine in any case. So she says anything that's not specifically created for English learners. That's really what I'm talking about when I talk about authentic sources. So there are many, many sources that would be considered authentic that have been created by a non-native speaker or a non-native writer. And I think they're just as valuable as those created by native speakers. Rita's put unabridged. You probably, in many cases, will abridge your sources because you can't always deal with a whole book or a whole film or a whole text. So unabridged is not part of what I mean by authentic. It's really about real world sources, let's say. So it doesn't matter if it's written by a native speaker, doesn't matter if it's abridged, but it's something that exists in the real world. It hasn't been created for language learners. And when it comes to sources of authentic texts, you're kind of spoilt for choice now in the age of the internet. It's very, very easy. In fact, probably too easy to get hold of authentic texts. And the problem becomes, how do you narrow it down? How do you choose what to select? Just briefly to talk about these, you've got, of course, YouTube, Netflix, Vimeo, great sources of video content, sources like the BBC or The Guardian for news, podcasts, and there's a range of places you can get your podcasts from, but they're a great source of audio input. If you're looking for books, then the University of Pennsylvania has a great webpage that they call the Online Books Library, and it's just a page of links to free books, places where you can get free books on the internet. So if you put that into Google, then you'll find that. Online corpora, such as COCA, can be a very, very useful resource. That's kind of a topic, a whole different topic for a webinar, so I won't talk about them in too much detail, but Cambridge has done a number of webinars, and the recordings are on our YouTube channel about how you can use corpora in language teaching. So I encourage you to seek those out. And of course, social media, for better or worse, is a good source of authentic language. I want to show you, though, one particular tool that I think is a good way of filtering down some of these authentic sources into something that we can use with advanced learners. Before I show it to you, this is the 4th edition of Advanced Grammar in Use. Of course, this is not an authentic text because it's written specifically for language learners, but it does provide you with some structure and guidance that can inform your search for authentic texts. So if you're using it with your advanced learners, you get the same layout that you'll be familiar with from the In Use series in general. On the left-hand side of the page, we have examples and explanations, and on the right-hand side of the page, we have exercises to check understanding. And from this page, I've just chosen more or less at random a specific phrase or a specific usage, which is this. And I'm interested particularly in this phrase, so I gather. So if we're interested in exploring this and using authentic sources, there's a great tool I'd like to show you, which is called YouGlish. You may have used it already. You might be familiar with it. If not, I'm going to show you an example now. It's a video, and the video includes 9 examples of this phrase, so I gather. There's a task for you to do, and the task is, of those 9 examples, 2 have a completely different meaning to the rest. Which 2 are they? So I'll play it once, just so you can kind of get an idea of what it is, and then I'll play it a second time so that you can confirm your answers to the task. So which 2 of the 9 examples have a completely different meaning to the rest? Here we go.
Hey, question. So I gather that you don't like reply to all.
And I also take care of the sound design, so I gather all the sounds. Sometimes I record my own sounds also.
One shot only tells so much, so I gather a range of expressions from all different angles.
So I gather it's 8 o'clock, and I must conclude, but thank you for your attention.
So I gather there's now an occasion for questions.
Yes, we do now have time for... From Libet himself, so I gather it's still a little bit controversial.
And so I gather that Earth Engine is free to use for nonprofits and for governments, but what
about... But rather a troubled figure, so I gather. He's Ghanaian in origin, but he was fostered by Italian parents, didn't get Italian nationality till he was 18. And he suffered a lot of racism on and off the pitch. So I gather it's quite rare to have a black Italian footballer.
Okay, so a few answers in the chat already. You can see from the video what YouGlish does. So you enter a phrase into the search box, and then YouGlish will find you examples of that phrase from videos on YouTube. And this video is simply me clicking from one example to the next. You can see, Brigitte, if we could just switch back to the video. Thank you very much. So you can see under the video, you get a kind of a bit like a subtitle that shows you what's being said. Obviously, you can make the video full screen so that your learners don't see that if you want. But it's very easy to just flick from one example to the next, and we get these authentic examples of a particular word or phrase or sentence from YouTube. Now, there are lots and lots of answers in the chat. You've already identified that examples 2 and 3 were the ones with a different meaning. So I probably don't need to play through it again. Thank you, Brigitte. Let's switch back to the slides. And Sabina has correctly identified that the different meaning is gather in the sense of collect versus gather in the sense of I understand. So we can kind of ignore those 2 examples. If you were my learners, I'd be asking you now a few more questions about this usage, the one that we do want to focus on, and thinking about the context that you've seen this used in. Do you think it's more formal or informal as a phrase? Answers in the chat. Sarah says formal. Marion says informal. Oh, we have a mixture. Interesting. Very interesting. So I would say it's a fairly formal usage. All of the, or most of the examples that we saw were examples of talks or lectures. So that's the kind of forum in which people generally speak slightly more formally, especially if they're the speaker. And the second question to you is, what is this doing? What does this phrase do? We could remove it from all of the sentences on the screen and we'd still have the kind of core meaning of that sentence. So why are people saying this? What does it add? Marin says, as a filler. Any other ideas? Some structuring or some conclusion. I think the idea of conclusion is correct, perhaps with respect to so. So there was a guy there who was clearly coming to, or two guys actually, and he said, so I gather there's now an occasion for questions. I think so there is absolutely concluding the talk. I don't think the gather part does that. Claudia's got it. Yeah, it softens the statement. It introduces the possibility that the speaker is wrong, and it kind of makes it okay to be wrong. This is the clearest, I think, with the last speaker, the woman. So it's fairly obvious, I think, that she's not a football fan, but she's talking about this footballer, and so she uses this phrase twice. So I gather, in order to indicate that this is her understanding, but there's a possibility that she might be wrong and she's open to being corrected. You know, if there's somebody there that says, oh, actually, it's not rare to have a black Italian footballer, then fair enough. That's tied to the kind of formal context. If you are on a stage giving a lecture, there's an expectation that you are an expert, and therefore you need to create the conditions for yourself to be wrong if you think that you might be wrong. Otherwise, you kind of cause trouble for yourself. So yes, I think this is best described as softening the statement. Thank you, Claudia. If we go back to our example, we can see that's slightly different again from what advanced grammar in use is saying. This is a different usage in terms of grammar because it's kind of a response to a statement. It's not a hedging device, but the meaning's obviously related. And so in advanced grammar in use, we've got a series of exercises to practice this structure. The meaning, the specific meaning of each of these phrases are going to be different, but we've practiced the structure. We've seen lots of examples and we understand a little bit better what perhaps the core meaning of this phrase is. So learners go away with a broader understanding of the phrase, a better understanding of its use, and a much better idea of how relevant it is in terms of which context it might be applied. So I think Youglish is pretty wonderful. You can put almost anything into it and you'll find examples. You can use it with lower levels as well, but the kinds of tasks that you've just completed, you can see that that's something generally that is something only advanced level learners will be able to do. First of all, in terms of just having the listening skills to pick out those phrases, but also being able to understand how the language is being used and why takes a lot of linguistic skill. In general, when we do this, and I think this is true of Youglish, it's also true of corpus sources. If you use a corpus to find different examples of a particular construction, you'll find yourself teaching at this level probably more fixed phrases, things like "so I gather," rather than structures like present continuous, for example. We kind of move into this grey area between grammar and vocabulary, looking at lexicogrammar. And when we do that, the focus is often more on use and context than it is on form. So the form of what you're looking at might be fairly simple, but the way that it's used is the thing that's really difficult to grasp. So it's not something like a third conditional where there's this complicated form and you have you know, past participle plus blah blah blah. It's more about how do I use this and when do I use it and why do I use it. So for many of the things that you might be teaching advanced learners, the form might be familiar, but the meaning and use could be new. So sometimes there's a challenge in highlighting that and saying, look, there is actually something new here. You need to look more closely. This is not something that you've seen before. Or it might be something that you've seen before. It's not something that you're currently using yourself. Let's examine it more closely and see how you might include it as part of your linguistic repertoire. And this process of presenting the language to the learners and letting them work out what's happening, it develops autonomy, which is obviously something that your advanced learners have a lot of already. So it kind of chimes with that skill of noticing and acquiring new phrases and structures, which is, of course, something that your learners want to do outside the class as well as inside the class. And if you're using advanced grammar in use to do this, then it's going to support you in recording that progress. Learners can see what they've learned. It's going to support them in practicing those structures, and just in seeing kind of how much they've done. All right, moving on. We've got two more things to consider as teachers. We want to ensure a sense of progress to make sure that our advanced learners feel that they're moving forward. And there are different ways of measuring progress. The most common one, I think, is usually just looking at the pages of a book. How much of the course book have you worked through? That's obviously not a very accurate way of measuring progress. That's the problem, I think, for many learners who might find themselves in an advanced class when they're not advanced. They've kind of worked through all the courses from A1 to A2, B1, B2, and now they're in advanced. So it looks like they've made lots of progress, but maybe their language, their actual skills haven't caught up. So this is a method. It's possibly not a very reliable method of measuring progress. Exam scores are another one, hopefully more accurate, especially if we're talking about Cambridge exams. You get a detailed, accurate picture of where you stand in terms of each language skill as well. A kind of self-reported percentage of comprehension. You can ask your students, how, when you watch that clip, what percentage do you think you understood? And if they understand more at the end of your course than they did at the beginning, then that's a measure of progress. Peer assessments is another possibility. Your students providing a kind of sense of where they think the person next to them has improved and where they might need to do more. And another one that I just want to explore a little bit more is by looking back on previous learning and using previous learning more in the classroom. Obviously, your advanced learners have a huge amount of knowledge that they can draw on and that they can look back on as they continue to study. And so I think it's really useful and important to do that and to kind of bring in that knowledge. There are different ways that we can do this. And one of the things that we want to do is really foster some creativity, particularly when it comes to exercises. I think it was Karen who said that she's fed up of doing exercises. She's done hundreds, thousands of them, which I completely understand. But if you are an advanced learner, we want to make it interesting to continue doing these exercises, but we also want to kind of bring in what you know. It's not enough to stick to filling the gap that's there. So, for example, this is a task in Advanced Grammar in Use, which aims to foster some creativity straight off the bat. So we're saying complete the sentence in any appropriate way. You have to begin with an ing form. So you're practicing a specific structure, but you decide how you complete the sentence. You know, you come up with your own meaning and have some fun with it. This is a task that doesn't specifically ask that of students, but we can still incorporate that creativity. So it's a matching task. We can ask the learners to match the sentences as they think they should be matched. And then we could simply take away the second half and say, well, now you've done that, you create your own ending. Do it yourself. They're still practicing their understanding of this new grammar, but they're able to incorporate some of what they already know and use a bit of creativity as well. Here's a kind of different take on the same idea of being creative. Playing with context. This is something, as I've just mentioned, that's particularly relevant to advanced learners. A lot of what they're learning is very specific to context. It might be particularly formal, especially when we get to kind of advanced grammar. The difficult stuff tends to be found in formal circumstances. So what we can do is to ask learners, for example, to complete the task as it's given, and then ask them, what's the context for this sentence that's in front of you? Where is it found? What kind of text has it been found in? What's the kind of surrounding meaning? Obviously, in number one, there's something to do with a crime. Somebody's been found guilty of something. So maybe there's a crime that's taken place. You know, what crime? What's happened? Where is it being reported? What's the context? There might be several different answers, several possible answers, but it's all about helping the learners to make the connection between the structure and the specific context and the register in which that structure is to be found. And once they've done that, we can say, right, now rewrite it for a different context. If you think that this has been found in, I don't know, a newspaper report on a crime, give me the same meaning as told by a man to his friend in the pub. How does that look? The same meaning, but a different context. How does that affect the grammar that's used? So really working with this relationship between context and grammar, but using some creativity at the same time and using what the learners already know. You can only do this if you've got a good understanding of the kind of contrasting context. So if you've got a good understanding of informal English, which your advanced learners undoubtedly do, then you should be able to kind of recreate the same meaning for a different audience. There are examples of where Advanced Grammar in Use asks you to do this, but obviously this kind of the principle, you know, do the task, what's the context, now switch it. That's something that you can do with many exercises, whether the book asks you to do it or not. And finally, motivational strategies. This is something I think we can learn a few ideas about from the fitness industry, because there are lots of people who attempt to get fit, you know, maybe get injured or ill. They kind of get out of the habit of it, and then they kind of fall back into bad habits, and things don't go so well. And they, as I mentioned, they get into a kind of cycle. I'm one of these people. And what we want or what the fitness industry wants anyway, is to kind of provide people with the tools to bounce back when things get difficult. So we can learn a few things from them. One of those things is the concept of vision. And this is nicely encapsulated, I think, in this quote, the idea that you need to taste the future in order to desire it. And this comes from a book by Zoltan Dornier and Maggie Kurbanieva, published by Cambridge. The whole book is about vision, so I'd encourage you to explore it. And they really delve deeply into this idea of helping the learners to picture themselves in the future at a time when they are proficient English speakers. So they're using English, they're using it fluently, accurately, they're getting things done in English. How does that look and how does it feel? And encouraging the learners to visualize that and use that as a tool for motivation. One specific activity they suggest is creating a vision board. The book is a few years old, so they're talking about doing it with magazines on paper, but I think it's something that you can do just as easily, probably more easily, as a digital project. But you're asking students to picture the kind of English speaker they'd like to become. How do they see themselves using English? They find images or phrases that encapsulate that and put them together on a vision board with themselves in the middle, picture themselves at the center. And this is something then that they look back on pretty regularly, just to remind themselves of why they're doing this, why are they learning English, why are they going through the pain of doing hundreds of exercises, and so on. Particularly when they hit a brick wall and when they feel a pang of self-doubt or when they feel demotivated, that's when they need something to turn to and to look at. Other options might be something like peer support. So you might create a space, maybe an online space where your learners can say, "Oh, I'm having a bad day," or where they share kind of success stories. Where they say, "I've just studied, this grammar point. I really understand it now, and I found a great example." Or I just watched this video on YouTube, and I was able to understand 90% of what was said. Kind of making it a positive space is often really good. Encourage your students to look back on things. So it's particularly useful to make recordings of their speaking that they can then return to and listen to and see just how much better they've become. We tend to do that with written texts, but not so much with speaking. So looking back on kind of previous language that's been produced, and then maybe revising it if there's time. That's a great thing to do. And finally, reflecting. What are the things that trigger self-doubt in your learners? Are there things that kind of, do they have a conversation in English and then kind of, feel demotivated? I used to live in Norway, and I always found it demotivating as a learner of Norwegian to kind of go to the shops, try and speak Norwegian and have someone speak back to me in English. And I think, oh, why do I bother? So that would be my trigger for self-doubt. And you need then a way to respond to that because you know it's going to happen. You need a kind of strategy. How do you deal with it? Do you look at your vision board? Do you do something else? It's about preempting that problem and dealing with it first. Okay, I've gone over time and I'm leaving Tanya without much time to talk. So I'll wrap up quickly. Just to summarize, we looked at 3 different ways of considering advanced learners and their needs. And we can do that in terms of target language outcomes, learning capabilities, and the feelings associated with being an advanced learner. And then we've seen that meeting those needs means negotiating learning outcomes, using authentic sources, ensuring they feel a sense of progress, and developing strategies to cope with self-doubt. I hope that was useful. Thank you for listening. I'm going to hand back to Brigitte.
Thank you so much, Matt. Very interesting. I'll just hand over to Tanya, who is an expert at talking very quickly, so she can attached to whatever time is left to her.
Yeah, I've been like warming up, like, okay. No, thank you very much, Matt. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. So lots of like interesting stories and of course tips there. So very quickly, I'm going to go through what we have for you available for you to teach and support your students, to teach grammar and support your students in their journey towards nailing the English grammar. So as you might know, the best titles, the best books that we have, that Cambridge has for grammar, are part of the eNews family. We call it like that, and this eNews family includes also titles that are there for vocabulary or idioms or collocation. So here you have an overview of what is there available. But the great news of the day is that we have the new edition of Advanced Grammar eNews coming up in April, this April. So, and the great thing is that, of course, as the previous edition, it comes bundled with an ebook. But the great new feature is that then it will also have online tests bundled with it. We will know more about the online tests in the next few months, and we have an upcoming webinar on the 27th of April, and we will that will be a good opportunity for you to learn more about these new features. So yeah, and these short tests, when students take these short tests, we'll get feedback right away. So stay tuned. And of course, this new edition will keep the format of the news books, which consists of an explanation page, a theory page on the left, and an exercise page on the right. On the ebook, with the ebook, it's possible to play the audio. So the students will also have the chance to do to practice their listening. So there was basically both the examples and the descriptions are played. And then the great feature of this book, the great thing of having an explanation page and exercise page, is that students have a clear reference of what they need to apply, what rule needs to be applied in the exercise. So it's great for self-study, it's great for as a support material during the lessons or as homework. There's a lot that can be done there. And yeah, the ebook is accessible on Cambridge One, our new platform, and it can be accessed on multiple devices, so tablets, smartphones, laptops, and so on. And don't forget that we have the CLET Augmented app with English grammar news for sure. So you can scan the pages and access the audio, and then also there are a further grammar explanation that you can access through there, through the app. And that's all from me.